Legislators sprint to the finish of the session, and Governor J.B. Pritzker hopes his agenda gets passed. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state issues, sometimes federal issues, and how they just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Legislature has been humming along, finishing up the session, end of May. Everybody seems to be getting along, except people who are upset about various issues. Well, and here to talk about it with me is Jerry Nowicki is back. He is from a reporter at the State House for Capital News Illinois. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Bernie.
And Jak Tichenor is here, and I know you were here one other time when a different host was hosting. Jak is the host of Public Media's Illinois Lawmakers show. And Jak, just as we get started, you have been doing this for a long time. Just explain, because I know stations that carry this show generally carry Illinois Lawmakers for a number of years now, and just what is it and why is it?
Illinois Lawmakers has been on the air since I believe about 1986, and the idea was to provide continuing coverage of the legislative session here with extended debates with leading lawmakers from both parties. And that's been pretty much our wheelhouse ever since the thing got started. I came along to the program as State House correspondent in 1991, and I've been with it ever since. I started as the host of the program in 2005, and now, let's see, executive producer, correspondent,
Yeah, and you're based in Carbondale.
I'm based out of Carbondale, but I'm in Springfield several months out of the year to do the program. And it usually airs the whole month of May and usually the first week of June to wrap up things. We also cover the veto session and the live speeches by the governor of the State Address and the budget message.
Gotcha. And in the past, Speaker Mike Madigan, who we know is a giant player in Illinois, if you certainly watch ads during campaigns, often in the past would do a segment on your program, and when he doesn't do a lot of interviews. I guess that hasn't happened for a couple of years, but just your thoughts on how did you have access to him? And why
he's a fascinating character in an interview. There's no question about that. I think the main reason that he does the program is that it has statewide viewership. It's on all 9 PBS stations in the state of Illinois, and it also offers an opportunity to do extended interviews where you're not just pinned down to 1 or 2 10-second sound bites. So there's an opportunity for the speaker and all the legislative leaders and others to discuss issues at length, have a good conversation about it. And it's not your typical political show. It's not a mud wrestling contest.
And why do you think he hasn't been on in the last couple of years?
I think a lot of it was toward the very end of the Rauner administration. I think that he started sending other folks out, like the new House Majority Leader, Greg Harris. As someone who was in contact with a lot of the main issues, particularly the budget making, he's been on a fair amount this year because he just took over for Barbara Flynn Curry, who was
Greg Harris
a long time.
Right.
Yeah, Greg Harris did. I fully expect he'll be back.
Okay.
He likes the program, I think, because he has a chance to have his say. He doesn't mind being challenged, and we have a good time.
Yeah, and he isn't under constant attack from elsewhere, so maybe he doesn't have to go defend himself these days. But who knows? Because Governor Rauner would attack him all the time. Governor Pritzker,
maybe not so much.
Trying to get along as the Democrats are there. Jerry, let's talk about one of the big issues that did pass in the last few days as the session was winding down with the Friday deadline. Progressive income tax made it to the 2020 ballot. So we had I guess it was all 44, I think, Republicans in the House, and there are 74 Democrats, so they had an easy way to pass getting this constitutional amendment on the November 2020 ballot to say that Illinois doesn't have to have a flat income tax but can have a progressive one. It's a major part of Governor Pritzker's platform. It had passed out of the Senate. It doesn't need a signature by the governor. It's a constitutional amendment, but the House had to pass it, and they did with 73 to 44. How did it go, and what does that mean for the governor?
It's a big win for the governor, but then it'll be up to the voters. I think 60% of those voting on the question, or 50% plus
everybody.
1 of everybody voting in the election. So ultimately, it'll come down to that in 2020, and then the revenues would be realized in 2021 should they enact a graduated tax, but he spent a lot of political capital on it, that's for sure. The Republicans aren't happy that it went through basically against all of their objections, but they were never going to get on board with it no matter what he did. And there was a property task force and a property tax relief fund that got some of the legislators to go on board from the Democratic side.
Which is just something the governor is saying he'll form to help ease the property tax burden. There were a couple of Democrats, Sam Yingling from the northern suburbs and Jonathan Carroll, also from the northern suburbs of Chicago, who had both said they weren't on board with this vote, but they both voted for it. I know I saw Yingling stand up during the debate.
Right.
All the Republicans, I think, got up and talked about how you can't trust Democrats or the legislature to keep the rates low, as they say they will. But the Democrats, like Mr. Yingling said, property taxes are the big problem, but we are going to work to fix them, and I think people deserve a vote on this. So that political capital got used, and these couple of errant Democrats found their way to vote with their party on this.
And I think that may be where you saw some of the speakers' will imposed behind the scenes in terms of getting something out there that the Democratic Party, I think, generally feels is the way to go with this, and showed that there was less daylight between the governor and Speaker Madigan than maybe some had perhaps wondered about, because the Speaker was keeping kind of a low profile. But at the end of the day, it's over the finish line. It's going to be on the ballot in 2020. I think the property tax study group is going to be really interesting, because how in the world are you going to come up with enough significant property tax relief to make up for the amount of money that the state doesn't give towards K through 12 education? That's why the property taxes are so high to begin with. And it's, you and I have been covering this for the last 20 some odd years or so, and that's always been the last hurdle to it. How do you actually provide enough money for K through 12 and at the same time provide some meaningful property tax relief?
The other notable thing is school boards will be adamantly opposed to any cap you put on property taxes and what they can raise in property taxes. I used to cover school boards in Leroy and Farmer City and McLean and DeWitt County, and the superintendents there would be so irritated when the legislator is giving them less money year after year after year from the state, and then talking about capping what they can raise and their levy to each year. It just doesn't really work that way. There needs to be more money going to schools if they want property taxes to go down, and that's what the governor said he sold to Representative Yingling and Carroll.
Yeah, interestingly, I mean, the 1970 Constitution, which will be changed away from the flat tax with this, did say that the state is supposed to pay the predominant
I think it said the majority, wasn't it?
It didn't say majority. I think it was predominant or something. It wasn't. It was like they don't have to do more than 50%, but it looks like it of funding through K through 12. And I remember, I think it was during the Jim Thompson years, the state was paying like 38%.
I think it's primary. Primary burden.
Primary funding, and then now I think it's like 25 or 26% that the state pays, and local property. And of course, the legislature a year ago redid the formula. They're supposed to be pumping more money into schools. They're supposed to, through this new formula, give more money to schools that actually need it to attain their educational goals. And they want to add like $350 million a year into it, all of which adds more pressure to new money that comes in. Plus, the state has the backlog of $6 billion plus the $6 billion they borrowed that they have to pay back.
Exactly, but the thing is, to reach that full funding for that new school funding formula, it's going to take billions of dollars to actually lift up those other districts that have been suffering because their property tax rolls are not that great.
Right. The Center for Taxing and Budget Accountability said that number should be closer to $750 million each year if you want to get to adequacy in 10 years. There's a $7 billion shortfall from adequacy as determined in the evidence-based model.
Which is why the state Board of Education had asked for some outlandish amount, or like a tremendous amount of money, I think in the last runner year, and they didn't get it, but they said this is what we need to get to I think what you're talking about.
And then this year they said, oh yeah, we're
So-
good with what the governor has. to
So is the
offer.
property tax task force, do we think that's just window dressing, or do we think it can actually accomplish something, or just give people an excuse to vote for this progressive income tax? I guess that's a cynical thing to ask. On the other hand, you know,
That's an interesting rhetorical question.
Well, I can tell you the committee that debated it, the Republicans absolutely think it's window dressing. Representative Carroll said, you know, I don't want to talk about the past. I want to be part of the solution. So I'll tell you that. As for me, I don't know what it will be or won't be.
Yeah, well, we've been having this conversation ever since Don Clark Netz raised the idea back in, was it 1994?
she ran against Jim Edgar saying she wanted to raise the income tax and lower property taxes, and Jim Edgar ran a campaign saying she wants to raise your taxes by whatever, 42%. Everybody remembered the 42% from TV advertising, and I think he won 99 or 100 counties out of 101.
And he came back with something that was somewhat similar
He
to
did.
that.
And it didn't quite get passed because Peyton
No.
Phillip, the Senate President Republican at the time, blocked it.
That's right.
So things come around and
Fastest
go around.
prologue around here.
It is. We'll have to see where it goes. Let's talk about another issue that I think wasn't expected necessarily to come up by the end of the session, but with what several other states, mostly in the South, but also like Missouri, are doing with abortion. We have seen that a very progressive rewrite of Illinois laws concerning abortion was actually passed by the House, saying that, basically spelling out, if Roe versus Wade were to be overturned at the federal level, Illinois would have, as the proponents say, safe and legal abortion, and as the opponents say, you can abort a fetus at almost any time without a lot of oversight, and this is terrible. How's it looking? And as we tape this show, the Senate hasn't acted on it yet, but there's an even larger Democratic majority in the Senate than in the House. I think it's expected that this will be passed this session, and Governor Pritzker is definitely for it.
Yeah, I heard it would be possibly Friday that it'll be heard on the floor. You know, it's just one of those things where it seemed like it was going to languish in Rules Committee and not go anywhere this session, and then maybe it was all the news you heard out of Alabama, and I think you said Ohio too. Maybe it was all that news.
And
that
I know
gave this
Missouri
thing-
was supposed to be possibly closing their last abortion
right.
clinic because of laws being passed. At Louisiana, there's a Democratic governor there that was going to sign, I had heard, a very restrictive abortion bill too. It's just the heartbeat bill, which means maybe within 6 weeks you could not do an abortion, and some women don't even know they're pregnant by that time. So it's a severe restriction on
Right.
Roe.
So all of those bills in other states may have given the moderates a little bit more political cover to get on board with something like this.
And put more pressure on the Democratic leadership to actually let that bill get out of rules where it had been, as you said, languishing for the last few weeks. There's a lot of pressure on that. And it's never a very popular issue at the State House. It's one that I think that most lawmakers would really rather not deal with it if they could, because it is so emotional and the forces on either side are so intractable about.
Yeah, people have these totally sincere beliefs
Yes.
about what should and shouldn't be done. I know Avery Bourne is a state representative from Raymond, Illinois, south of Springfield. She came into the legislature when she was 22, like a little more than 4 years ago. She is expecting her first child in 6 weeks. She handled the arguments for the Republican side, including asking lots of definitions. You know, how do you define what a doctor can do and what viability is and that kind of thing. And the Democrats are just as passionate
Right.
about what they were saying. That, you know, one representative recalled her mother being in a hospital bed before Roe versus Wade was the law of the land, when it was illegal to get an abortion, and having a young woman come in the emergency room, in the room next to her where she had a gallbladder problem, and the woman had used a coat hanger to try to abort her own child and ended up bleeding to death after being berated by doctors and police for breaking the law. So very emotional on both sides. But Illinois, I think, when you look at what the southern states are doing and when you look at what Illinois is doing, it comes down to the numbers. Elections matter. There used to be in the legislature, and particularly before the cutback amendment, when there were 3 members from each district, so you always had somebody from each party. But now I think all the Republicans are pro-life. They opposed to these abortion bills, or the ones that certainly that expand them. And most of the Democrats are pro-choice. And the Democrats have overwhelming majorities, and we have a Democratic governor, and that's where we're going as Illinois.
And we're seeing that on so many other issues, like we were just talking about with the progressive income tax, cannabis legalization. A lot of these other things are moving, and there was some question: is this overreach by the Democrats? Well, or is it a situation where they're merely responding to the folks back home who sent them there in such big numbers?
Yeah, I think one interesting part of the debate, some of the argument against is if you make Illinois have such liberal laws, people from other states will travel here to get abortion, and yet some of the proponents of the bill said, well, if you're living in Missouri, particularly if you're poor or don't have a lot of resources, and you can't get an abortion in your state, you should come to Illinois. So you have such different views of this thing. Now, the Catholic Conference also put out a statement before this. There are so many tough issues before the legislature. Let's not deal with this one this year. They're, of course, trying not to get Illinois to pass these progressive laws, which, by the way, the sponsors say we're basically putting into law, codifying the things that court decisions have already said. So they claimed that, unlike the Republicans claimed, this was wildly expanding the ability to get an abortion in Illinois. The proponents, Kelly Cassidy in particular from Chicago, who was the main sponsor, was saying we're just putting into law what court decisions and our previous laws have said, especially if Roe versus Wade goes, Illinois will have states' rights to do this. But the Catholic Conference was saying, just don't deal with it because so many other contentious issues are out there. But it's looking like the Democrats are controlling in some of these other issues too, like the progressive tax, and Pritzker may be getting his way on a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So.
And the women on the that were proponents of the bill, their argument was trust women and their decisions they make with their doctors. It's as simple as that. So.
Yep. Well, it is an ongoing argument, and as Jack notes, some of these arguments go around and around. But Illinois wasn't always in the super abortion rights states, but that's where we are today, I think. And we are, of course, as we discuss it here, it has to go back to the Senate and then to the governor, but the Senate has lots of Republicans. Recreational marijuana, that is a really complicated bill. It has grown to more than 600 pages.
Yeah.
And as we tape this show, the Senate has passed it. The governor wants it. Some people are still opposed to it, but there were changes made in the bill, and it's looking like Illinois may join some other states, that, including Colorado, where you can buy marijuana legally if you're 21.
Yeah, even at a bipartisan roll call, was it 2 Republicans?
I think it was 3, wasn't it,
Two or
in the Senate?
Well, they can call it bipartisan. I know Jason Barrickman from Bloomington, I believe he was on board because there were changes in the bill that had really caused concern about how many people could be have their records cleared of past marijuana convictions, and they lowered by a lot the amount of marijuana involved in that. So you couldn't. So it's clear you weren't a dealer; you were just a user. Although I'm sure some law enforcement types would argue that a lot of charges get cut down, so you plead guilty to something, so you might have done more than what you were convicted of.
Yeah, and Barrickman's concern was also a constitutional one, because there were some issues on, well, is this something, can the legislature actually do what is essentially a pardon or offer clemency? That's something that's reserved for the governor. Now, we saw under George Ryan a few years ago, he basically said, we're not going to do the death penalty anymore. So he commuted the sentences of all the folks who were on death row. Mm-hmm. So there was precedent for it, and enough folks went along with this. They, as you said, they went back to this 30 grams for possession thing. If it's upwards of 500 grams and you were convicted of that, there is a procedure in there for petitioning the courts to have that record cleared.
And the reason I think it was able to get to this point is because there's 2 years of work that have been put into it by all the sponsors behind it. There's
Heather
Staines,
yeah.
Rep. Kelly Cassidy, Toy Hutchinson, a senator, and Representative Gordon Booth. They've all just been negotiating these things, and criminal justice reforms were a major thing for them.
A lot of this is, and the governor talked about this during the campaign too, it's not just we want money from the sale of marijuana and the regulation of it. but we also, too many, as they would say, black and brown people or people from those neighborhoods have been put in jail much more often for offenses where if you are maybe from a different neighborhood, or if you are an upper economic level and you have a good lawyer, you don't go to jail for whatever amount of marijuana you had. But if you're a poor person and kind of caught in this cycle and the police stop you and it's in your car and you go to jail, and it's just happened more often. So the bill has incentives for people to get into the marijuana business in poorer neighborhoods to make sure. So there's a lot of social justice aspect to it to try to even things out. And as Toy Hutchinson, who, by the way, I think is president of the
National Conference of State Legislators.
Right, she's a big deal nationally. You know, she said the war on drugs has failed in her view, and we are trying to make amends for that and even things out in Illinois, which again, it's a Democratic majority doing this, but that's the belief.
And it does kind of come down to, it did slow down the process a little bit to have some other people's voices heard in this. You know, obviously the Republicans had a lot of concerns with grow your own and with the expungement issues, but there were some folks on the Democratic side of the aisle who also had some questions about that. Right. And I think this brings this thing closer to becoming a reality now. We saw how it was a bipartisan effort in the Senate. I was talking to some of the Republican House members today. They think it will also have a fair number of Republicans on it there.
Well, interesting. I did, just before the taping of the show, I was at the State House, and Marty Moylan, who is from suburban Chicago, who is he's a Democrat, and he's kind of led the effort to have members sign a petition, let's go slow on marijuana. He seemed upset that in a caucus meeting, the Democrats perhaps were moving forward, and he was saying there's still so many problems with it, you know, so maybe you can buy this amount today and this amount tomorrow, and that's too much. So there are still clearly objections, and they might come from both sides, but we'll see how it goes.
You can still home grow 5 plants if you have a medical card.
Right, and they took out of the bill that any person could home grow, because law enforcement was particularly troubled about that.
But if I'm not mistaken, Representative Bob Morgan has a bill that would expand the conditions that allow you to get a medical card, and would expand the amount of professionals that can issue a medical card.
Yeah, we'll see how all of it goes.
It could be a pathway toward growing your own at some point.
Okay, a couple other issues. There was another kind of partisan, but probably also regional split, where the House passed a bill this week to update gun laws so that people getting a FOID card, firearm owner's ID card, would also have to get fingerprinted. The people against this, many from downstate that I saw, had buttons with a big fingerprint on it with a red slash through it. It passed the House. We don't know as we do this where it's going in the Senate, but this people who say the Second Amendment is paramount, we don't want to infringe on it, say you shouldn't have to spend the $30 or whatever to get a fingerprint, you shouldn't have to get your fingerprint in a database just to express your constitutional right to have a gun. And yet there was this case up in Aurora where a person who had his FOID card revoked, but they didn't catch it, or maybe they caught it late when he applied for a concealed carry license because he had a fingerprint at that point, but nobody ever collected the gun. And the Chicago Tribune has found that there's like 30,000 cases of people with revoked FOID cards that may not have had their guns turned in because law enforcement isn't following up. So this is a step that people say, including the governor, this is needed for safety, but the gun rights folks are against it. And as we sit here, we don't know if the Senate's going to pass it.
Right, so the Illinois State Police, they say they just simply don't have enough money or great enough appropriation to enforce all of the FOID revocations. And as the bill stands now, with a $10 fee for every 10 years, I think 6 of that goes to the Department of Natural Resources, and the state police are saying, you know, they really don't participate in revocations. So even the $10 paid now, the state police only sees 4 of it. So I think I forget.
I think it goes to $20.
Goes to $20
$20
every 5 years.
For 5 years
Every
instead of
5.
$10 for 10 years.
Right.
Yeah, so it would expand the price, which is not a giant cost, but then the fingerprinting would be expensive.
Yeah, and the DNR is cut out of that. So it would greatly expand the funding they have to deal with revocation.
And the compromise was they came down with I believe it was going to be $50 instead of 10, and then for 10 years it'd be $100, and so that was ratcheted back down. And that's one of the true remaining political fault lines in the state of Illinois between the city of Chicago and the rest of the state.
Chicago was always very anti-gun, and downstate is we're hunters and we want our freedom and,
Right.
and et cetera, and personal family safety, that kind of thing. I'll just quickly mention, because we're running out of time, but gaming, there's giant possible gaming bill that as people watch the show, it might be happening, it might have happened, or it might not have happened, with an expansion of like 6 casinos, possibly more payment from the video gaming machines in all the bars and restaurants, including like 600 of these machines in Springfield itself.
Sports betting.
And sports betting. And I guess it's probably not fair to ask either of you gentlemen if we think by the end of the week this will pass.
How many times have we watched these things go down right to the wire? And the problem is with gaming, it's so complicated because you've got everybody from now professional sports leagues who want to be in on the action. You've got the fantasy sports groups. You've got the casinos
Like
territorially
the
all
Rivers
around the
Casino
state.
near O'Hare Airport.
And the problem comes down to it becomes a Christmas tree. It's the old joke here at the Capitol.
People keep hanging ornaments.
And that
amendments.
eventually it
Right.
goes over like that. So I don't know. I mean, Terry Link, the Senate sponsor, still seems to be very confident that they can make this thing go.
Right.
But time will have to tell.
I will say there was a late push by the city of Springfield and its mayor to pass a resolution,
Right.
which did not pass on emergency passage in the city council, to try to get Springfield included in the number of places that might get casinos, which include like Rockford and Southern Illinois and Chicago and Danville and Williamson County in Southern Illinois. But Springfield was not included in the late negotiations because there really hasn't been a big local push for it. And so just by the mayor saying we want that was one thing. I will mention that during this last week, just to note, we have a governor with some resources. There was a party on last Wednesday at the governor's mansion. There was a big tent. George Clinton, those of us who are old enough to remember Parliament and Funkadelic, was actually the musical act. That was the surprise musical act that the governor brought in to help celebrate the coming 85th birthday of Secretary of State Jesse White, who the governor called the treasurer, and the governor and his wife set this up, and the legislators were all invited, I believe. So this is a governor who can put on a party. We'll see if that generates the goodwill going. With that, we have to end it for now, and we'll talk more about what happened in the session the next time. Jerry Nowicki and Jak Tichenor, thanks for joining me. I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for joining me and us, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.